Well, everyone, hello to the listeners out there. We are, if you've read the title of the episode, you know what we're going to tackle today. And he's a beast.
He is somewhat beastly.
We do have to establish some ground rules, though, as to how many impressions, sniffs, and so on, each of us are allowed to do for this episode, because it could get annoying.
I really feel like we should be allowed a generous number of them.
I would say that only one per person once.
Oh, well, I already used up mine then.
Each person can have one tick. Like, somebody can do on so on and so on. Another person can do the sniff. Then there can be the person like, yeah. And
I can grab my shirt, but no one can hear that. It'll sound like this.
It's true.
So this is, I don't know when we're releasing this episode, but it's very close to the same time that I'm releasing a video on Zizek's philosophy. And the reason for that was mainly that...
Because you want views?
Mainly for clickbait. No, but I needed a video of a philosopher that I already know. So I knew Zizek because I had to do it under a time crunch. But what I found looking up Zizek is that he's like canceled by a lot of people. Usually fancy people who whine about his decorum.
The elites.
Exactly. It's the fancy leftist poli-sci bros that go to, the Ivy League schools, and now they're trying to make a media career out of it.
I wonder who that is.
And we need some new enemies anyway. I think we've beat the Jordan Peterson horse to death. So if we want to turn our ire elsewhere.
One thing that's uncharacteristic in some ways is that like the four of us are all academics and we have somewhat different backgrounds in like our focuses, but we all like Zizek, which I think is maybe a little bit uncommon perhaps these days in academia.
He's the king.
I don't know if I would say that, but I think we all have fondness, and
he's the one who made theory cool for like this generation.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, probably.
What do you anticipate some of the criticisms of his work is?
Well, I can actually just give you a couple anecdotes about Zizek. I have noticed him. I mean, my department in the political science department, as you mentioned, I noticed that theorists I've come across who I respect there have been multiple instances where I've heard just disparaging, dismissive comments of Zizek made, obviously by people who didn't bother reading him and just saw him. I heard one person refer to him kind of disparagingly. It's like, oh yeah, I one time went to go see Zizek in one of his comedy routines, and then I heard another person who was reading my dissertation proposal where I do mention Zizek. And, I was just looking for feedback, not necessarily him to be on my committee, but he did kind of mention, he's like, yeah, like, this is an interesting topic, but the fact that you take Zizek seriously means that we probably would have a lot of diametrically opposed commitments in theory.
That's interesting. The fact that you take Zizek seriously implied to that person that you have all of these views that he would necessarily disagree with.
Yeah, I know. Exactly.
Like, Zizek gets accused of being racist and sexist and anti-Semitic. Those are some of the big ones on the probably on the canceling side.
Yeah, I mean, he gets critiqued from both the left and the right. I mean, it's interesting. The second professor I mentioned is probably like a classical liberal, like their research is mostly on like Hume and stuff like that. So that maybe you would characterize that as like a critique from the right, maybe, or right of Zizek. But it's true on the cancellation side. There is a lot of critique from the left, I think, as well.
Yeah, I think the article that we were all dancing around is the October 2019 article in Current Affairs, What is Zizek for? That was written by, I think he's a PhD at Oxford, specialized in physics. But this article made a lot of waves because it's just lacerating. It accuses Zizek of racism, obscurantism, pretty much everything under the book.
I think he tried at the end of that to also like put Zizek's arguments into formal logic points, and was very frustrated that he couldn't, and then threw up his hands and said, this is all bullshit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was a pretty clear article. I mean, it actually provoked a considerable response from Zizek, who published, I think something like 2 or 3 reply essays in Philosophical Salon, to which the author of this piece responded, basically reiterating his points. So it was some juicy leftist infighting, certainly.
Yeah, the current affairs has been a host of some pretty dire Zizek criticism.
Yeah. Well, I can understand why. I mean, I actually like Nathan Robinson. I enjoy his writing. I think that he's wrong about this, and we can get into why. But having read a bunch of his articles on this, he thinks that the kind of hyper academic, very referential, super theoretical approach that Zizek takes to radical advocacy is wrong. He wants things that are more down to earth, grounded in people's material concerns as they understand them, that kind of stuff.
I believe his reference to Zizek was as an embarrassing clown of the left.
Yeah, something to that effect.
But no, I don't take... Nathan Robinson also said that he was smarter than Marx and that people should read him instead of reading Marx. So I don't take him seriously either with his little feather cap Willy Wonka routine.
Well, he is a good writer. I will say, I read his stuff pretty regularly on current affairs, and he's very clear, tends to be pretty empirically driven, and focuses on practical rather than theoretical issues. So I think this is why people either love him or they hate him. But I can certainly see why he would be hostile to Zizek, since Zizek is kind of the embodiment of everything that he thinks leftists shouldn't be.
I think Robinson. I actually really liked his article. I remember you linked it about workers' rights in the context of cancel culture. Right, if your job is able to fire you, the problem isn't necessarily with you being canceled, but with your employer's ability to just fire you for no reason. But yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of leftists see Zizek and they see that he has kind of a weird view that isn't necessarily linked to what they would normally think of as Marxism, and I think just don't really understand him, don't take the time to actually read his philosophical points.
I am irate towards these fancy boy leftists, especially, and probably because I'm from the sticks. So my educational career has been able to grind out a lot of my what do you call it? The sticks, the rural tendencies, we'll call them, to
the regular people.
Yeah, but then
the folksies.
But then the gatekeeping, suit-wearing, trust fund, Yale, Ivy, Oxbridge, whatever. When those people gatekeep me or infantilize or dismiss as clownish, then I get my back up.
See, actually, I would tend to agree with you on this, and I'll say why. I think, one of the interesting things is I think Nathan would actually turn this around and say, well, this is exactly why he doesn't like people like Zizek, right? Zizek is hard to understand unless you have a pretty firm education, and a background in critical theory and the history of continental philosophy and so on and so forth. Which is why, in his mind, we should be focusing on things that seem to have a more down-to-earth appeal, like advocating for universal healthcare, criticizing people on the political right who are popular authors, and so on and so forth. I actually think that there are a lot of people I know, including people with some pretty rough backgrounds, who are interested in philosophical issues and like to learn about this stuff. And so I think he's misguided in assuming that we really should just be focusing on more practical things because that's what people are interested in, because I actually think that people are quite interested in the ideas that underlie a lot of these positions, right? And I think you can see that with somebody like Jordan Peterson, right? I mean, Jordan Peterson has a huge fan base from people from all walks of life, in part because he appeals to their interest in having an intellectual justification for their positions. And I imagine that Zizek fulfills a similar role for those of us on the left, right? And I think people are interested in knowing about that.
I would agree with that, except that it's hard to know what his positions are. You'd have to read quite a bit to even get to that point. But anyway, we have an unstructured podcast, always not unstructured. We'll say unscripted and always unscripted. And some of us have a chip on our shoulder when it comes to, let's call it the sanctimonious dismissal as a hot take own when you clearly don't even have a fucking clue what you're talking about. Because as I see it, this is, in my opinion, a totally different set of circumstances than an academic disagreement, like the profs you were talking about earlier. This is basically a battle of images.
Lazily dismissed.
Yeah. Well, at least for Willy Wonka, clout is at stake.
Yeah.
And
it's fine.
Is an image celebrity, but there's also a long, not very careful, but long career of thinking, supplementing that image celebrity. And to have the gall to hand wave it away could only come from someone who is pompous enough to say it would be better if Marx had never been born. Oh my God. That's not an academic debate. It's a claw for clout for Willy Wonka.
Well, actually, I kind of want to like be a bit harsher towards actual academics, because I will say, you know, getting into academia, doing my PhD, being around whatever like so-called top scholars, I gotta say I found it very surprising the level to which there's, you know, lazy thinking and like lazy dismissals for lazy reasons. And I think Zizek is a prime example of somebody who I often hear academics, very, you know, decorated academics, just saying dismissive things, and I know that they haven't read them. Yeah. And I guess like I would say that the most valuable tool I ever learned in academia was when I was doing my master's. And I remember my supervisor at the time on my master's thesis, it was on Rawls, and I was like very dismissive of a lot of things Rawls had to say. And he really taught me this like super valuable lesson that, you know, people who you initially don't like, when you go and read them, like if you have an attitude of charity, you're going to find that there's something interesting, that there's a reason why people like them. It's not just, you know, nonsense. And I think it's a virtue as an academic to adopt an attitude of assuming that there's going to be something valuable. If a thinker is very popular, there's got to be a reason for it. And it's on you to do the work to find out why people like him. And I have to say, it's shocking the number of, you know, high level academics who don't seem to have that virtue, which is like actually pretty obvious when you think about it.
I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that in itself is a very Rawlsian kind of idea when it comes to interpreting political philosophy. In fact, I think he stated almost exactly that point in his lectures on political philosophy that I've read, right? You should always be as generous as possible when interpreting a figure. You should always presume that they're right. And then if they're wrong, you know, you should try to strengthen the argument to see if it can hold water, you know, all that kind of stuff. But I agree.
There's some self-reflexivity, and I appreciate it. But I'm from the farm, and I fucking hate smugness.
I mean, also from an academic perspective, like I'm in the same sort of stage too, building a dissertation around a bibliography and trying to come up with a reading list. Like I can't imagine the sorts of reading lists that Zizek would be a figure on when like you get your committee together and you present them with your proposal. I mean, you've already done your comprehensive exams, I guess, and you have this reading list. Like, what role does Zizek play on the reading list, first of all? Like, if we're saying he often repeats himself and writes the same book over and over again, okay, so which book do you put on there? And then what's his role on your reading list? Is Zizek just going to be a foil for your own interpretation of Marx, or a foil for your own interpretation of Hegel or Lacan or whatever? Like, I can't see him contributing to a comprehensive exam list or a bibliography for a monograph that you have to present to get your PhD, especially in an environment where you might expect your supervisor, your committee members to already be hostile towards Zizek's ideas. You can't put him on there as anything more than a foil or somebody to just contrast your ideas with but not take seriously in like an academic sense of the points you're going to make, not dismissal, but
right. I was reading Less Than Nothing like for this video rereading, and he quotes Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I think
but for
intentionally. I don't remember exactly. It was like I think it was the Wikipedia article of a movie. So, you know, hopefully he's seen it, but we don't know. But
Probably
it was
not.
in the Wikipedia article, and he was citing
There must have been a reason
But-
for it. I don't think he's just doing it for,
No, I think
will say
Less
this,
Than
though.
Nothing, if you need one book that has all of Zizek in it, it's probably that one.
I would say that, yeah, it's definitely his magnum opus at this point. But like, I think just speaking to Eric's point, I think one of the reasons why people are a little bit reticent to accept him as a serious academic is precisely because his work is so transdisciplinary, right? I mean, take Less Than Nothing, right? I mean, formally, the book is supposed to be about synthesizing Hegel and Lacan, which is an eminently academic task that anybody could recognize, right? But at the same time, the book touches on everything from politics and history, and then it has a huge chapter on quantum theory, which was really controversial, right? Since a lot of people are like, what are you doing talking about this?
And virtual reality porn.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, with Zizek, porn is kind of a must, right? But I think there are people who are reluctant to say that there's still a place for that kind of systematic philosophizing, a la Hegel, right? precisely because they'll say, well, the disciplines are separate for a reason, and it takes a long time to become skilled and adept in actually understanding the kind of technical implications of this or that scientific theory. So you're probably better off just not engaging with that. You know what I mean?
My thought really doesn't derive from his work, though, or a judgment of this work. I think to be interesting, or to make philosophy and theory interesting, you have to be a bit of a provocateur, and he fills that role exactly perfectly. So to that end, I'll transition to our second part of our structure here. And that is to ask, what is philosophy for, according to you guys? I don't know if you know what he says, but it's in, I think, Parallax View. He pretty much states philosophy is to articulate problems well, which is quite different from someone like Deleuze or Badiou. For Deleuze, philosophy is about creating concepts, so it's meant to be a productive enterprise. And another reason that Zizek is chastised often is for not being productive. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? How does this benefit the left cause? But according to Zizek himself, that's not what philosophy is for, and that's not what he's doing as an author. So I don't know. Sound off what you guys think philosophy is for, and then maybe we can find out what is Zizek for, thanks to current affairs.
Well, I remember him talking about that somewhere in one of his talks. He describes philosophy as, I think he even said, it's a very modest task, right? It's not going to solve some huge things. It's just like you have to get clear on what the issues are. What are the philosophical puzzles? State the question better. What is reality? I don't know. The philosopher's job should be to interrogate the question, but not necessarily expect to find a solution to that question. But get clear on what we even mean. And I think that that's right. I mean, I think philosophy. I agree with that definition. I do think philosophy is just is for asking those kinds of fundamental questions and trying to get clarity on them and trying to state them in a clear way. But I suppose I would say you'd hope you might get some sort of answers from it. But I think it's true that at least for those answers to be anything worth anything at all, I think Zizek's answer is important and correct, that you have to get clear on what the problem is before your answer is going to be worth anything at all. And it's true that most of the time in reality, philosophy is, and probably good philosophy would be preoccupied with getting clear on what the question is, I think, and definitional. And yeah,
I think I don't know if I could give it a definite answer, but I mean, that kind of definition of clarifying issues, like I mentioned, in the Michael Brooks tributes that are going on right now, and when Cornel West and Zizek were on, they pretty much agreed on the same sort of thing, right? The role of philosophy is to clarify questions for people so that they can understand or engage more effectively with issues. But I mean, that also has the sort of lingering idea of the professionalization and institutionalization of philosophy, that it's going to produce people who are public intellectuals who have a relatively one-way relationship with their audience, right? They're talking to them, but they don't get talked back to very much. So they have a pedestal and they have a voice. And so in that situation, when you're a public intellectual, yes, you can clarify problems or what you think are problems for people. But I think from seeing the way that fans react to this sort of material, podcast fans of theory, these people are not interested solely in oh, there's problems in society. What do? I'm going to turn to podcasting. They themselves are looking for a more therapeutic effect of philosophy on themselves and their lives, right? People tend to like this sort of stuff because they think it not clarifies issues that we have to engage with in more effective ways, but that it seems to bring, I don't know, things in their personal experience with the world into more relief. So it has a more, I guess I'm saying it has a more therapeutic than a sort of social justice kind of effect on a lot of people. And those are the sorts of people who are not doing philosophy as a profession. They're not public intellectuals. They don't have a large audience with which they have sort of a one-way communication relationship with. They are listening to this stuff and reading this stuff because they think it clarifies things about life and meaning and purpose. And so, again, yeah, they're more of a therapeutic effect. And that's not, I guess, maybe totally the answer, but that's something that I'm thinking about.
I would frame it somewhat differently, although I think that Victor and Eric both hit on key aspects of his thought that are certainly there. I see Zizek, at least in my interpretation, as performing kind of denaturalizing unmasking of our interpretation of the world. And he articulates this very well through a number of different metaphors, where he says, one of the problems with classical theories of ideology, for example, is that we assume that ideology is just about taking off our glasses to see the way the world really is, right? When actually we have to recognize that the way that we see the world is indelibly stamped with ideology, right? And various different naturalized ways of thinking about things. And so this is why philosophy has, in some sense, an unending task, because its goal isn't to try to tell you how the world really is. It's merely to kind of break down or deconstruct or dialectically implode the various different overdetermined ways that we try to conceive of reality and give it a kind of solidity and naturalness that isn't actually there. And you find this also when he talks about his own ontological preferences, right? Where he says virtually every kind of ontologist who's ever written on the subject assumes that reality has to be complete, perfect, and whole, right? Whereas I'm saying actually that reality is a lot more like a Pokemon game, which is one of my favorite metaphors he gives, right? Because, in a Pokemon game, you're wandering around and you assume that there has to be something outside of the forest that you're currently trapped in, when really there's nothing outside of the forest, right? Because nobody actually bothered to put anything there. And the reason why he interprets this ontologically is he says, I see reality as being fundamentally some kind of catastrophe, right? It's incomplete, it's riven with mistakes, it has deep problems within it. And most of the history of Western philosophy has been some effort to try to explain away this incompleteness of the world by suggesting that it has a law-like character, or there's some kind of imminent telos to existence that we should all be beholden to, and so on.
And so on. It is definitely about this unmasking, and I think that's one of the draws of public intellectuals as opposed to academic intellectuals. But I think it's a product of this probably celebrity culture that we feel like you have to produce something that's going to be effective. What are you doing for the cause and whatever? But yeah, my interest in philosophy has nothing to do with that. It's more like, I guess, a ritual, like religion without religion almost. It's a way to see coherences, to produce coherences, but really to feel less alone in the world. And I know that sounds kind of like soy to say, but but when you read someone that is articulating the thing that you are trying to get a grip on, that's really the reason that I think philosophy is important. And Zizek definitely is one of the, his objects are cultural objects. It's Starbucks, it's porn, it's the Batman movie, it's Titanic. And this is if you learn to, I think people wish, I wish that I was able to see as much as he sees in every little object. And that's kind of why I admire him.
Yeah, no, I agree with that a lot. I think what's interesting about Zizek and the way he's taken up, or his critique too, is I think people see him commenting on the cultural realm, on the political realm, and he does it in a kind of irreverent, amusing way. And then he calls himself a Marxist. So then Marxists who are more practical will but he'll say things that seem contrary to Marxism, and he'll be kind of a buffoon, and they won't understand. But they don't. But all these people don't actually go bother read what his philosophical core is, which is, I think, the platform with which he then makes the comments he makes about culture, about politics. So they just see the comments he's making and the humor and the irreverence, but a lot of the time, and then they also see that he's not being loyal to some Marxist vision of praxis, but they don't actually bother to do the work. And then I think his irreverence, that he doesn't act like a normal academic, puts a brighter target on his back, I think.
And there's an example of this that I can give real quick is the political correctness thing, because he's against political correctness. People are upset that he's against political correctness because, you know, you don't care about the people of color or whatever. But his reason for being against political correctness is very specifically Lacanian, because Lacan has this sort of dialectic too, where you have these encounters or ruptures from a negative, and it kind of collapses your system, but then you have to rebuild around, or you have to rebuild the symbolic, and the symbolic is where you find all these codes, and then you get something called a master signifier, which Lacan calls it. And he just sees political correctness as being the opposite of emancipation, because you rebuild basically a speech code. And so there's a reason for why he says, I don't like political correctness, because it's against his project, which is ultimately to like annihilate the subject or bring subjective destitution. So yeah, it's inflammatory, but like you said, it's grounded somewhere. It's not like he's just being reactionary and you can't make me call trans students by their preferred pronoun like Peterson. He's giving reasons, but yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, do you think that I'm curious what you guys all think, because the humor aspect, like, I think this is one of the things that makes Zizek unique, right? That and I wonder, like, I've often wondered, like, you know, I think that his philosophical insights, you know, I do see him in a lot of ways as a philosopher of like the fallible human animal. Like he's very focused on like how fallible we are. Like that's, you know, because a lot of his interest is exploring like the disconnections, the nothingness that's at the core of us, you know, the way we try to cover it over with our desire and all these things, you know, this futile kind of dialectic of desire that we're all in. And I think there's a humor to that. You know, I think there's a connection that he sees. He sees the absurdity, and you know that things should be laughed at. I mean, some of it I'm sure is just a personal, like a kind of personal character trait that he has, that he likes humor. But I do think it's compatible with his philosophy. But I think I've said it before maybe on a different episode, or maybe it was off the air. But you know that I do think this kind of collides with what I often see many academics as having a personality type that is kind of like an ascetic ideal. There is very much a kind of asceticism with academics. There's a seriousness, there's a smugness with many of them. There's like this care that we have to be careful about everything we're saying, and we have to be precise. And I think Zizek's kind of like, well, look at all the, you know, chaos that's inside of our subjectivity already. Like this trying to be precise. Like, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time? Like, you got to laugh and you got to just say what's on your mind. Like, why are we pretending that there's this, you know, this tranquility or this what's the word, stability?
I remember in the movie Examined Life, he literally went, like his segment, has anybody seen the movie Examined Life, the documentary?
Yeah, good one.
It is, yeah.
He's got a 10-minute segment on there.
Exactly, but like almost every other academic is in some like hyper formal setting. Like Martha Nussbaum is like walking along the water. I think it was like Michael Hart is like literally rowing in the middle of Central Park. And Zizek just goes into a dump. And I was like rummaging through the trash. And like he finds a porn magazine and he's like, you call this porn? Like fucking just throws it away.
Double fisting hot dogs.
I was watching it with my roommate at the time, and he's like, man, if you didn't know any better, like knew who Zizek was, you'd think he was just like some homeless guy, like literally rummaging through the trash, like beating off to like discarded porn or something like that. But just to like your point, Victor and Pills, he has a really good joke that always, I think, testifies, I think, to the kind of analytical power behind the humor. Because he uses this to make a point against political correctness, which was what we were talking about before. Where he says, what's the worst hell you can put a child through? It's telling your kid, you have to go to grandma's house, right? Because the kid doesn't want to go to grandma's house. He'd rather stay at home playing his PS3, PS4, PS5, right? And he says, in classical understandings of authority, the patriarchal figure would just say, you have to go to grandma's house. There's no if, and, or buts about it. And this was obviously bad, but on the other hand, you know, at least authority was overt. You could know who the oppressor was, and you could try to resist it that way. And he said, the problem with this new politically correct kinds of authoritarianism is they work subversively to change your subjectivity. So the example he gives is, rather than your dad just saying you have to go to grandma's, your dad will sit there and be like, of course it's up to you whether you want to go to see grandma or not, but you do know that your grandmother's very sick and very old and she misses you, so do whatever it is you want. And Zizek is like, this is where the true horror comes in, because you are expected now not to just go to grandma's, but you want to go to grandma's. You have to desire it. And, you know, and he says this is the kind of attitude that you see with political correctness.
But
right?
no, this is a much more radical form of coercion, I claim.
Yeah.
It's a much more authoritarian. It's like a covert authoritarianism, because it doesn't just prescribe your action, but it prescribes your subjective state. You have to desire, you have to want.
Exactly.
It's a kind of melodrama thing he does, but it's consistent with the point he wants to make, but it's still kind of melodramatic. And that's what I love.
The other thing with these jokes is that they stick in your head. They really make they make theory matter, and they make theory not boring, which is pretty much the only goal of my life at this point.
A little more accessible than it might have been before, because like his big thing is to be a popularizer of Lacan, who is one of the most difficult writers you could possibly read. Yeah, Zizek's jokes. Yeah, they are.
I'm holding up that book. Yeah,
they're helpful.
All his jokes.
They're helpful, and they make it like I love his sensibilities with those things. Like it's great.
Exactly. Like, and whenever I think about that joke, I'm just reminded of like any bad relationship I've been in, where like the girl sits there and it's like, no, I know that you're doing what I asked you to do, but that's not enough. I need you to want to do what I asked you to do, right? And just like the sheer feeling of oppression that comes from it, right? You know?
It's like a no fear philosophy book come to life. He's just funny. He plays with concepts. He plays with ideas, and he's not shameless, but he's irrepressibly funny in situations where he shouldn't be. But it's fine, because you know seriousness and comedy are always like so close to each other. Well, I find that I have a sensibility where I love comedy more than drama or anything else, and that's why Zizek appeals to me quite a bit in his mannerisms and his way of doing philosophy. Yeah. Even if I don't agree with everything he says, I don't like. I could go at this philosophical level. I don't agree with him, but otherwise, like his delivery and his overall politics and project is I'm fine with it. I have no problem with it.
But I think it's really useful, though. I mean, like I was trying to explain ideology to a bunch of students, right? And I played them this video where he's talking about Coke, and he's like, "Do you not remember that the slogan of Coca-Cola back in the 1980s was just this is it? Here we see ideology at its purest, right? Where the signifier of the Coke in and of itself becomes almost a transcendental kind of quality where you invest it with all of your desires. And it is literally the be-all and end-all of existence." And like they were watching that, they're like, I never realized a commercial had so much involved in it. And I'm like, hey, fucking neither did I. But I'm never going to look at a Coca-Cola the same way again. And it does do a really good job of showing you how, to use Pill's term, you know, the symbolism of ideology and its kind of determinacy is saturated through the life world, right?
That was a bad Halloween German Zizek costume voice.
yeah. Was that supposed to be Zizek? I thought
it sounded like
Freud.
a Freud imitation, like a Looney Tunes Freud.
Yeah, I don't think we can get canceled for this though, because it's Zizek.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, not to be the authoritarian father, but would you all like to move into the section where we talk about his philosophy?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to say, like, why I find him useful for my own work, like his philosophical insights. I think that fits in this section.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
give it a go.
We got to figure out how to do this, because my video is going to. Why don't I summarize what my video is going to explain?
Yeah. Okay. Do that.
People have already probably seen that, but
yeah, we can like take off from there so we don't repeat.
Yeah. So
yeah, good idea.
I mean, you start with Hegel, and the important part of Hegel is the dialectic. And sublation or Aufhebung, the special word where there's an overcoming. And in this progress, there's always a development. So you're trying to develop, for Hegel, it's like history develops, the concept of freedom develops, and you want to be more self-determining, because that's what like freedom is. But the problem with this development that's always going forward presumably. I mean, that's kind of bad Hegelianism to say that because it doesn't always go forward. But, there's a movement, a progressive direction. And the reason that doesn't work all the time for Zizek is what Matt was talking about earlier, Lacan, this like whole, oh no, sorry, it was Victor, the whole in subjectivity and all the contradictions in subjectivity where we're just desiring endlessly. So desire never has an end, and there's no free will in Lacan. There's no like free will argument that could be made based on Lacanian philosophy because you're just stuck forever, rebuilding the symbolic, desiring, forever sad, boohoo.
I was going to say that if we are going to be talking about desire and repressed desire especially, this is where I'm going to start hitting on Eric, like pretty consistently throughout the rest of the
it was coming.
It
doesn't feel very repressed to me.
Can't help it. We're being brought out of ourselves. Jouissance.
Exactly. Right. I mean, I
beyond the limits.
All right. So that was stage 1 and stage 2, but then you need to return to Hegel. You're going to use Lacan's what's called the the excess of desire, or the lack of the lack, the less than nothing thing. There's a little interminable excess.
The indivisible remainder.
Oh, there you go. That's it. Now, based on this, you refuse to be yourself. Like Christ did on the cross. You're abandoned by God. There's nothing left except that one little bit that is you, which is the nothing of a nothing. And you can use that as your freedom to push into an uninhibited new Hegelian land of like a new Aufhebung, but you're kind of outside of history. And of course, this comes along with all of the, sorry, I said you're outside of history. You're not determined by history. You're self-determined at that point. And then you just toss in all the Marxist stuff we know, commodity fetishism, ideology, obviously an updated Althusser version of ideology. And then we can have like an egalitarian future with destroyed subjects that see themselves as self-determining and free instead of as, stuck in these loops.
Does he actually think that that's, but does he actually think that it's possible to overcome that, or just momentarily maybe?
I think to be consistent, they would be moments of freedom, but the communist aspect of it, or the egalitarian classless society, is kind of the driving force behind why we would want to become free subjects. So capitalism obviously has to go.
He does sometimes imply that love can provide that kind of not ultimate and unending, but like at least quasi-permanent reconciliation, right? Where he says that the thing about real love is that false love, the kind of love that you see, prevalent in the capitalist society, is one where you value other individuals as objects. So you only really value them insofar as they gratify your desire. Whereas true love, of course, comes from recognizing this other person as somebody who has fundamental flaws and not loving them in spite of, but in part because of their flaws, since their flaws are determinative, right? And when you get that kind of recognition from another person, right, who says, I don't just love you in spite of your flaws, but because of your flaws, because that's who you are, it provides that sense of completion and fulfillment that we can't get. And I imagine his conception of communism is meant to politicize this, right? Yeah. In terms of a more universal kind of love and recognition.
I think that's consistent with what I see as like the Zizek's main point, which is just like really dwelling in, as I said before, the fallibilism of the human animal. And I think like that makes sense to me, because like you're loving another human because you're cognizant of all the flaws and the way we're constantly being tempted to lie to ourselves, to build these imaginary symbolic structures that try to reach some kind of, shiny, like smooth wholeness to give us that. But like we're always falling into this kind of conception in our mind that is making it feel like we've achieved this wholeness. But I think I've always read Zizek as saying that it's like impossible to get away from that like, you can have moments maybe, but like, that like love is just a momentary, like really recognizing, that those real moments of love is kind of in those moments, not when you have this, like transcendent feeling of that is like kind of intoxicating, but maybe it's actually in those moments, of seeing the flaws of like the crisis, but then you still love in spite of all that, because like that's the rupture in your fantasy of, this person, but yet you still love, even though you've been exposed to the horror underneath it, but you still have, right? So that's the moment. So it's not, so I would just hesitate to like, or push back against any sort of conception that makes it seem like it's something that resembles like smooth, harmony or something that. It's really not. It's really like the moment of it's being confronted with the horror and then still kind of going beyond.
He even gives us a nice materialist twist where he says, like, this is one of the reasons why you see so many people who don't actually genuinely love one another, right? And it's precisely because they dematerialize the individual they're supposed to be in a relationship with. And then they're horrified when they found out that individual has a body with all the things we'd associate with. And this is also kind of a testament to like why the kind of jokes that he makes are funny, right? Because he likes to make like shit jokes and sweat jokes and sex jokes, right? But all these re-emphasize the fact that we're embodied beings, right? That with bodies that have all kinds of flaws and disgusting features and abnormalities and stuff. And being loved in part for having that is what provides us with a sense of security and completion, right? So really, and this is what I think this is pretty commonsensical, right? I mean, it's why you tend to care for somebody more when, they carry you home because you're drunk or, they forgive you for farting really loud in public or whatever it happens to be. Because, they kind of acknowledge that you have a body and that it has its flaws and that you have your weaknesses and they care about you regardless, right? Whereas
exactly,
a lot of the we see dissociate from the body and try to have this ideal image of what we are dissociated from all that, right?
Yeah, I think that a Zizekian view of love would say that, all these conventional ideas of like why we love somebody, like all these idealizations, like that's really just a house of cards that you're standing on. Like that's not the thing. Those aren't really the things that are going to be like love.
Yeah. I'll just give an example from a buddy of mine once where he said that he walked in once and he saw his girlfriend taking a shit. And he said, like, I thought about it for days afterwards, and it just profoundly bothered me because, like, I knew that she must do that, but, like, seeing it happen really, really bothered me. And I was like, well, this is true love now, right? Like, you share it, like, in the intimate processes that like, everybody has to go through. And, now you can love her for who she is, de-transcendentalized, as it were, as a material being,
Exactly. I mean, this is for me why I find Zizek so important, and like, maybe just this is connected to just my love of Lacanian thought in general, but I think Zizek is like very useful for this. Is just for me, like my interest is political. I'm in a political theory department, and like for me, my interest is about what like is kind of trying to clarify the question: what does it mean to be emancipated? What does it mean to be democratic or whatever? And I find Zizek useful for really dwelling on the fallibility, and I guess I find one of the things I find frustrating and unconvincing in democratic theories that come from the continental tradition is they will often take continental insights that kind of unravel like the myth of progress, that they make things contingent. So therefore, if everything's contingent, then anything's possible. But I always feel like there's another move that needs to be made, which is to recognize the fallibility and like the weakness and like the reason why we should try to limit our expectations of the everything is possible because other things are contingent. And I think Zizek is useful for thinking about something like, like how likely is it that we're going to, develop as, democratic citizens who all want to like work together and deliberate on things, and like see each other for, a valuable other citizen, right? This is all to me really unconvincing stuff. And I feel like you need someone like Zizek to is useful politically for thinking about those kinds of points of fallibility and the way these kind of democratic dreams can be a bit phantasmical. And maybe that's also why Zizek comes into conflict with other Marxists, perhaps, because there is this other aspect of him.
He's very much about desacralizing, I think.
Exactly.
Like destroying the fantasy,
denobilizing.
And that's like, again, I mean, I don't want to hate on political correctness, but because we already used the example, that's the thing. That's like compelling love, but doing it through coercion, through a threat of punishment versus a law, so that, or you just feel like you're going to guilt someone into doing it. Because when you're guilting someone, then you're using their psyche against them and their whole, father apparatus. So the idea is if we could get rid of all coercion of all types, all ideology, all fantasy, then it would take a brutal honesty, but that's the only way to, resurrect ourselves in a Christological metaphor.
Yeah, it
Precisely.
obviously makes him different from other people who use psychoanalysis too, because obviously, like, sexuality and love and desire is very central to, like, psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan. But what makes him different is what Pills was saying too, is that he's not using this to sort of sacralize, like when Jordan Peterson brings up sex and love and marriage, it's usually for the sacred union of the nuclear family, and he's not using it to poke fun, and he's definitely not using it all to make these like larger philosophical points. Like, those are the things that we need to justify in his world, whereas like Zizek's idea is like, oh, the female orgasm is the new version of the ontological proof of God, he says in his book. And he says, instead of dismissing this, let's undermine it from the inside.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of moves that Zizek likes to make, like reversing things, right? And I think, if we could also, use the term nobling, ignoble, like there's a temptation to want to make things like the family and love and, establish them as these noble ideals. And he's obviously trying to undermine that. But beyond undermining that, I think what he's trying to identify with his comments about love and all these other things is that the very nobility of those ideas actually lies in the core of their ignoble aspects. Like, so you locate like true love, right, in a sense, in like the most ignoble instances, the things that are most embarrassing, the points that are most crisis laden and most, embarrassing and are revealing the flaws and fallibilities of the human being. That's the location. So it's like reversing it, and really the ignoble exists in all this fantasy and like imaginary symbolic structure that we try to overlay all of those things on. That's where the ignoble, I think, lies for him.
Maybe this is why he's so hated by the professional opinion havers, because it exposes to them their own humanity in a way that they find revolting with their little feather caps.
They can't be self-serious.
I think this also applies to his interpretation of reality itself, though, because you see a lot of these affinities in the ways he thinks about human subjectivity and the way he thinks about nature, predictably, since he's Hegelian, right? Because he says, think about the way that most of us have tried to perceive nature. It's almost always been in this highly reactionary way where we say that nature is perfect, right? Nature is harmonious, nature is teleological. At its apex, we did say nature is basically conceived of, created by, and ordered by God, which makes it a divine creation. And the only reason why anything bad happens is because humankind fucks it up, right? It's our fault.
It's like a Rousseau type view.
Exactly. And Zizek, I think, is actually kind of refreshing by saying, no, what does he say? Like, nature is a catastrophe, right? Nature has kind of all kinds of weird idiosyncrasies and destructive tendencies. It's not sacred at all. And so we shouldn't be all that surprised when sometimes bad things happen. And just to
like
go back
COVID.
to... Yeah, well, this goes back to an episode we did on conspiracy theories, right? Because he says, when you buy into this reactionary vision of nature and the world is harmonious except when interfered with by human activity, you're very prone to thinking in conspiratorial terms by saying, well, if something bad happened, it can't be because nature is at fault, or it can't be because sometimes shit just happens. It has to be because somebody's responsible for it, right? Somebody disrupted the perfect harmony. Whereas Zizek is kind of refreshing by saying, no, sometimes catastrophe just occurs because in a lot of ways, nature is catastrophe, right?
And this kind of connects to his whole critique of New Ageism and Western Buddhism, as he likes to call it, because we present these things as like false re-sacralizing, try to re-enchant the world, but doing it on like very shaky grounds, like the Buddhism or whatever Western Buddhism that we have is basically a colonial product taken from these places where they wanted to make their religion seem more appealing so that the Christians wouldn't just like wipe them out. So they said, no, it's about nature. It's not really a religion. It's just like a way of life. When no, it's like, it is a religion. It's a religion here, 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 and here. And then he tells that story about the Japanese Buddhist monks that justify war crimes in World War II, saying like, no, it's not actually you killing them because it's the bullet's flying through the air, it enters their skin, but it's not actually murdering anybody because this is just a natural process of material interacting.
Yeah, I do think there's some room to criticize him on this point, and I imagine Eric would want to, though, because he's sometimes critical of the environmental movement on this basis by saying that absolutely we should care for the environment, but it's primarily for anthropocentric reasons, right? That, we need to care for the environment because it is material that we'll need in the future. But we should at all points resist the temptation to resacralize nature and say that, well, nature was harmonious and nature was healthy, and the only problem is humanity's come in here and kind of disrupted that with its pollution, and so on and so forth. And the example he usually gives to criticize environmentalists is the creation of oil, right? Where he says, 800 million years ago, oil was created basically because the planet exploded into a new volcanic age and billions of species died, and then their remains were compressed into oil. That goes to show you that the idea that mankind is somehow uniquely a disaster for the planet is wrong, right? The planet has always been a disaster, and we're not uniquely responsible for the crises that are befalling it, even if we should manage them better, right? And
he calls that like a modern retelling of the story of the fall.
Yeah,
it's fantasy.
And so he's really
it's hard to think about. It's comforting to think about us coming here and ruining some harmony. It's like better. It makes more sense. It's less, it's less traumatic to think about it that way because we're the problem. It's not just that nature intrinsic to it is chaos and the potentiality of destruction.
Exactly. And he says, you can watch movies like Fern Gully or Avatar. I mean, criticize Avatar on this basis, right? And it's always exactly this kind of biblical metaphor, right? It's like nature was perfect, everyone lived in harmony, and then man arrived and man destroyed everything by building factories and waging war and putting pollution into the environment. Whereas his argument is, nature isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Nature is pretty fucked up and useless and a lot of garbage. And so we shouldn't be sacralizing it, even if we should be trying to tend to it better for human purposes. So he's very critical of
and for very specific contextual, pragmatic reasons, we need to be like correcting things, right? For very specific, like kind of down to earth reasons, as opposed to like some ideal of like an undisturbed nature or whatever.
Exactly. I just imagine that like if you were a deep ecologist, right, you'd probably take serious issue with this, right? Because he's essentially calling you a spiritualist, right? That you think that there's some beauty to nature and some imminent qualities to it. When really nature is just the dump that in the movie, right? It's a whole lot of nothing.
And of course, at the same time, Zizek constantly talks about how like climate change is a huge threat, right? So like it's not like he's some anti-climate change person. Like he knows it's like a huge threat. He acknowledges that it's he talks about it as one of the main potential future problems, right? He talks about like genetic stuff, one of the main points of crisis, right? Like an environmental. So he's certainly not some person who doesn't care about the environment. He just sees it. He thinks it needs to be conceptualized in a more precise way, I suppose, that doesn't fall into this kind of idealizing fantasy.
Yeah, but that's why I like him, right? Like he has a unique take on the subject matter because usually like people who tend to be environmentalists also tend to explicitly or not adopt a deep ecological view, kind of like the story of the fall that you were talking about, right? That
Well, I was going to say we see the same kind of fantasy go on too. Like I notice it with like indigenous politics stuff. I feel like like white critical theorists often just like to think about indigenous cultures if it's this was this harmonious, like peaceful, and totally ignores that actually indigenous people are human beings just like the rest of us, and they had wars and they had like horror and torture and all kinds of stuff too.
Well, that's why Zizek hated Avatar, right? Because it embodied all of those things, right? It had this very nostalgic and spiritualist dimension to it, where it's like, oh, there's this beautiful planet and the people there live in harmony, and then human beings come with industrialization and modernity and everything falls to shit, right? And he's like, well, no, first off, like these are human communities, or at least anthropic communities, where the people have all the problems that they do back on Earth. And secondly, this planet is just matter like anything else. It's not sacred or special in some way, shape, or form. So people can use it to, empower themselves in some ways. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as they do so in a responsible manner, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree with the things.
Really?
I don't disagree with most of what Zizek says about. Like, I think he has a very measured, like, perspective on environmentalism, and it's good. And I think you should always approach environmentalism with the idea of ideology as like a lens, because obviously environmental groups are pure ideological assemblages as well, right? So you should always approach them with the idea that they have a system of ideas and beliefs, and there's no necessity that those correspond to anything in reality. Like, if you want to just win the game by definition, then no modern biologist, systems biologist, no modern ecologist believes nature is a harmonious system. That's just not, that hasn't been a thing since, but that was a thing up until the 60s, right? Up until the 60s, everyone assumed that everything like humans did to the planet would sort of correct and absorb the problems and impact and return to a state of sort of harmony. And now we regard all living systems as far from equilibrium systems. They are pretty much the definition of like not in, like a pure state of equilibrium would just be like nothing, like just total entropy. No order, nothing. It would just be pure even distribution of all heat and matter, right? Which is not obviously not a state we're going for. That's not what environmentalism is shooting for. But you have to be aware that environmental groups like Greenpeace and whatever, the Sierra Club and all those big environmental groups have agendas. They have ideologies, they have optics, and they're involved in politics. So all of those things means that Zizek's view of ideology critique is going to be always an important thing to consider when you want to get into environmentalism and not just be like a naive realist about the world and greenhouse gases and the impact of nature on human affairs. If you're not going to do that, then you should listen to Zizek.
Right? He's really against any sanctimonious reasoning for anything, even if it's like the sanctimonious reason, like for a good reason. So like, what's wrong with believing that the planet is an interconnected whole? Because at least we might take care of it. But he's also going to say, no, you can't do it that way.
He does have a good reason for this, though. And actually, I think it was a really clever observation that he made, because he says one of the problems with seeing nature as kind of a harmonious whole that we just tend to disrupt is we have this sense that there's kind of an inner purpose or narrative to existence. And this tends to play into our fantasy that somehow we're uniquely special, that we're here for a reason, and that there's a divine or some other power that's looking after us, which can, of course, be another reason why we say, well, we don't need to worry about climate change because just like at the end of the movie, how everything winds up okay, because of some kind of natural intervention, we'll be fine. And Zizek says, no, we're just part of nature as well. We're here because of entirely contingent accidents. There's absolutely nothing special about us, right? It could very well be that we'll be destroyed tomorrow. So you better fucking wake up and realize that there's not going to be some at the 11th hour rescue if you allow the planet to fall to shit, right? If the planet falls to shit, we're going to be wiped out with it. It reminds me of a George Carlin joke where Carlin was like, I hear everybody talking about the planet, save the planet, save the planet. The planet will be fine. The people are fucked, but the planet will be fine. It'll carry on doing what it normally does. And this is kind of the essence of Zizek's environmentalism, right? Where he says, stop presuming that there's some kind of inner purpose to nature or your own life, because that leads you to believe that there's something special about you, which means the universe will correct itself in order to save you. That's not the way things work. If you don't fucking take some responsibility for what's going on, then our delicate ecosystem will be destroyed and we'll be wiped out.
Yeah, I always say, when we talk about the Anthropocene, for example, as the successor period of the Holocene, that comes with an ideology attached to it, right? It was proposed in 2000 by some scientists, but the way that it's been uptaken into media and the humanities is that anthropos means human, and it's our fault that we've done this to the planet, kind of thing. And then you have to ask a series of questions after that. If you want to be rigorous, though, you say, well, who's responsible? Who is it an Anthropocene for? Whose fate is really at stake here? And then we ask, well, isn't it better called something like Jason Moore calls it, the Capitalocene, right? Maybe we should point to capitalism as a kind of dynamic force that's changing our human nature relationship. And the whole idea of the deep ecology movement too, right? It's been critiqued from within as well. And it comes with an ideology as well. Just like Anthropocene, deep ecology, right? That's a Norwegian guy named Arne Næss started the deep ecology movement, and he based it quite heavily on his reading of Heidegger. Yeah. And so it promotes a kind of localism, right? like withdraw from the global community and get involved in local projects, farm your own food. It's like it's a real localism. And a lot of people today are going to say, well, we live in a globalized world, and like obviously neoliberalism, part of the force behind that ideology is the global trade and economy, how our economy and our lives are completely interconnected with the rest of the world. So is deep ecology going to be an environmental movement that's going to be very helpful or successful in the future? Probably not, because we need to take that sort of globalist element into account. And that's so you always have to take like Zizek's points seriously about these things, even if you don't agree with them.
Yeah.
And my disagreements tend to lie more in his sort of metaphysics and his ideas about nature and ontology, rather than in these sorts of cash outs on the public facing end about what he says about environmentalism. I don't have as much a problem with what he says as maybe sometimes where it's coming from and how I'd frame it. But otherwise, it's usually very sound, and you shouldn't disregard it.
Can I just say that this is a millennial podcast, because I can't think of any single philosopher that we've discussed. We're all in unison that we like the guy, pretty much for like the same
it's true.
reason.
It's true.
Like pretty much every single one of us is like, yeah, great,
He's a very helpful dude to disagree with.
He's very
he's
helpful. He's helpful for a lot of things, and like I wanted to bring up, like just emphasize the point and shift it a little bit to politics, because I think he's so good on pointing to, and this is probably why he makes enemies on the left, because I think his whole philosophical system, right, everything we've been talking about, also like of kind of calling out these fantasies, right, works really well. And he's pretty merciless in criticizing. I think when the Occupy movement was happening, right, he was pretty merciless and kind of being like, what now? And then, he talks about, I remember at a talk once he was saying, I always talk to these activists, and they're like, 50,000 people at Tahrir Square and and at Singtagma Square, and we were all, so ecstatic and he's like, I'm not impressed by that at all. He's like this kind of, and he's so good at criticizing, the ecstatic moments of political mobilization, and he's always pushing, I think, activists and being like, okay, so you have your little ecstatic moment, but like, what now? Like, what next? And that's where he makes the point about, V for Vendetta, how he wants to see, he said he would sell his mother into slavery to see V for Vendetta 2, which is like, after, so they burn down Parliament, they get there, they're all there. So what now? How do you organize things? What are the actual steps you take? Like, what kind of political system are you going to build? Like,
he did say, he had this hilarious little monologue about this that actually wasn't keeping with my own experience about a lot of the Occupy people in Toronto. Where he's like, I went there and I asked him, like, what do you want? What do you want then? And he would say, like, well, and they would give me, like, the stupid platitudes, like, blah, 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 like, money should work for people. And he's like, and my God, Hitler would have agreed with something like that. But, I mean, it is true, right? And I think we all have that kind of dissatisfaction sometimes with left-wing politics where, I made this joke last week, right? Everybody says we need a more radical kind of politics. And radical almost always seems to be just a throwaway term. For basically saying, I don't know what exactly I want to achieve, but it has to be different than this.
But Zizek is so good at revealing, at like, kind of exposing that so much of this more radical alternative with his kind of like Lacanian and Hegelian like underpinnings, how like he can connect it. And that's maybe why people are hostile towards him, to being like, oh, you're actually like enjoying, like there's like jouissance happening here. Like you're loving this aesthetic, this ecstatic fantasy, and you're kind of having a little mental orgasm thinking about a more radical alternative, and he kind of sticks it in people's faces. I think that.
Jouissance is the perfect theoretical word for all of those things that he's tearing down, because you're not allowed to have any sacred cows, and that's kind of why he attacks so many different things through jokes. Often, it's not like he's just shitting on everything, but he always is able to point out, here's your sacred cow, here's why it's wrong, or here's the history of it, or here is it in context, or what do you do next? It's always pushing against or tearing down those re-sacralizations, which is funny because I think he is really a secularist Christian.
Yeah.
His philosophy is, or materialist Christian, I should say. It's a materialist Christianity. And he says for him, the most important moment in Christianity is not like Christ dying, but Christ being abandoned by God. That's the moment he points to as like, this is the destitution of the subject. This is when even God falls. We have no idols left. Now what do we do? And that's the moment of liberation, the final step into Hegel.
That's a stage in the transition when Willem Dafoe's on the cross and he's looking around at everybody and he's not in pain. He's not registering anything anymore. He's just kind of looking around with a blank stare.
I'm actually really happy you mentioned that because that's my favorite Christian movie, Eric. Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese.
Yeah, that's that like almost that absolute recoil moment where you just completely separate, and then like he has, I don't know, I'm tempted to just bring anything. You traverse the fantasy. You get to the revolutionary consciousness through that like moment of subjectivity.
Yeah, and can I just clarify too quickly about jouissance too? I don't think that he's like against jouissance, right? Like or like people experiencing it. I think he just wants those things to happen responsibly in a way, right? Like I think he's just pointing to how easy it is for subjectivity to get like caught up in these cycles and like not move beyond. So I think like, so it's not like, I'm just worried. I don't want people to think, that he's some kind of, has some sort of aesthetic ideal that you just have to be like, contemplative all the time and be thinking beyond those things. No, like life has to be enjoyed. I mean, you have to have these jouissance moments. You just have to understand what they are, and you have to understand what's underneath them. And like,
just to make like the important theoretical point about jouissance is that because jouissance is that kind of idea of desire transgressing some kind of boundary, but for Zizek, like desire is non-sensuous in a way, in the same way that Kant thinks of reason or rationality as non-sensuous, right? Like for Kant, desire is sort of a sensuous desire, and we have to get rid of that. We have to become disinterested, and we have to submit to like reason. Whereas Zizek would say with Lacan that desire also has that non-sensuous aspect of it too. So when you encounter something that short circuits reason, like the sublime, for example, right? Sublimity, the mathematical and the dynamical, right? The large or the forces of nature that dwarf your capacity to understand those things. And desire actually follows the same pattern, whereas Kant wants to sort of relegate it to sensuousness and the body. For Zizek, it's also part of the sort of transcendental fabric of our subjectivity too, that desire is also a kind of non-sensuous thing. So when you encounter the mathematical sublime where something is so large and then reason sort of steps in, that's the sort of thing when desire is frustrated, the sort of pure desire, the ideas of the pure desire step in and drive you in certain directions. And that's the sort of transgressing aspect of jouissance. It follows the sublime in certain ways.
Well, just to kind of play off of Victor's political point, I actually think that one of the really virtuous things about Zizek's approach is precisely how he desublimates so much of the world, as Pills would put it, like knocks down our sacred cows or desacralizes them one after another. Because if you think about like the origins of modern conservatism in Edmund Burke, right? Edmund Burke's first book was on the sublime and the beautiful and that distinction. And there's a clear political implication to this book where Burke essentially says, look, some things are just too big for the human mind to apprehend, and they fill us with dread and a sense of impotence, and so we should be acquiescent towards them, defer to them, as it were. And he brings up a lot of religious examples. And there's a clear connection between that and Burke's conservatism, right? There's this idea that the human mind is too small to ever apprehend society in all of its complexity, so we should be cautious and incremental in changing anything, if at all. And what Zizek does that's really spectacular is just say, no, most things aren't particularly sublime. In fact, a lot of the things that we sublimate are just like the emperor in the fable, right? They have no clothes. Once you kind of strip them of their ideological veneer, you realize that they're just as human or just as fallible as everything else. And consequently, you'll be less willing to defer to them as a source of authority or a source of signification, right? And he brings up a lot of funny examples about totalitarians, right? And precisely how totalitarian and authoritarian figures like Nazis try to sublimate themselves into these incredible figures. When really, if you deconstruct them, you realize they're quite comical at their base in a Benjaminian sense of the word, right?
And that's part of Zizek's sort of self-image too, is he loves talking about Stalin because Stalin was the perfect example of a kind of ideology where it has to take itself seriously.
Yeah.
But like at its center, it knows it's not serious. Like it knows it's not legitimate. Like when Stalin goes out there surrounded by bodyguards, like carefully kept away from the common person and says, this is the workers' party. Like they know it's not serious, but their ideology runs on that denial. So if anybody sort of talks in a public way about how it's not serious, they'll be executed.
Wasn't there?
He's great at
go ahead.
reshuffling those elements too. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, isn't there a joke or like an anecdote he has about how if you were like in whatever the council, the Stalinist like USSR like parliament or whatever, and somebody gets up and starts criticizing Stalin and saying like you're a murderer and you've done all these things, but then if somebody else gets up and says how dare you say those things about him, Zizek claims that guy who called out the guy would get killed first before the actual guy who criticized the party, because you have to keep up the illusion that you can have free discussion. That's like more important.
Yeah.
Right.
Like
than the guy who calls
solidarity.
it out.
And again, that's kind of why we need that to maintain that pure contradiction philosophically. That's why he keeps Lacan or reads Hegel through Lacan, because Lacan speaks to these true contradictions, or we believe something knowing that it's false, and then act like we believe it anyway. And then we think that, no, they did this in Soviet Russia, but this happens. This is American capitalism. This is like Starbucks. Like I'm gonna buy ethically ground coffee, so 1% of my $4 cappuccino goes to, I don't know, a Bolivian child or something,
Fair trade, whatever.
Yeah, I blow my
it's
load
great.
every time I do that.
Like his reversals and the ways he kind of reshuffles all of the elements of what he's talking about too, because then you have this situation where Stalin, you can't really joke about him publicly, but he's like, say, perfect material for South Park or something like that because he takes himself so seriously. And then you have this situation in America where the South Park guys like refuse to make episodes about Donald Trump because he's already like his own joke. He's already the butt of everything he says. And we all like he projects taking himself seriously, but he probably doesn't take himself seriously. And even our funniest writers of political commentary just don't touch him because he's just a joke already in his being. And he sort of reshuffles that idea of Stalinism and the lack of comedy, but everyone's sort of privately making jokes, but the jokes show that you love him.
Isn't this exactly precisely why like academics, maybe like priestly aesthetic academics, hate him? Because he just is focused on, that nothing should be taken seriously. And like, I don't know, I think a lot of, uptight academics, I think they're defined by seriousness.
We don't have time to do
Serious
philosophy. We need to have a revolution. Well, that's not academics. Those are leftist magazine, right?
Yeah,
those
well,
are
that's the
leftist
other
magazine
example,
writers
right?
or say we don't have time to philosophize about this because we have to take care of the cause and workers' rights or whatever. Yeah. And then the academics are taking themselves totally seriously because they think that they're like reinterpretation of, I don't know, Kant's antinomies is like world changing and everybody needs to read this book immediately.
I think actually one of the most lacerating political critiques he ever gave of a major figure was actually his critique of Heidegger, who appropriately enough he called the philosopher without a sense of humor, right?
Yeah.
And he pointed out that Heidegger embodies a lot of everything that we're talking about, right? Really took himself incredibly seriously, right? Like wanted to speak with the voice of a prophet, talked about big B being in kind of divine terms, re-sacralize the world in a certain sense, and then wound up, of course, supporting all kinds of reactionary views and being kind of a nincompoop, if you think about it politically, right? And the criticism of Heidegger really works in part because it operates on all these levels, right? He's criticizing Heideggerian metaphysics, he's criticizing Heidegger's personality, but he also says, one of the things that's most problematic about Heidegger is this kind of really ostentatious sense of self-importance, where he says the history of the Western world is essentially the story of its metaphysics, which of course puts philosophy at center stage, right? when really like the whole history of all these nations, all the people who made them up, is really just a dispute between philosophers. And I find it really refreshing that Zizek says, how silly is that, right? To assume that really, publishing, a paper on Husserl's phenomenology, et cetera, is vastly more important than the tectonic events that impact millions of people out there, right? How stupid do you have to be to think that this is really what matters, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think that probably the reason that we are kind of drawn to him, and maybe our generation is drawn to him, is because of this profound opposition to sanctimonious people that are, I don't know, dreams that we don't believe anymore, or that we can't believe. They look too stupid to us.
So I don't know, guys. Like, I think I was actually thinking about it more just like the four of us, that maybe we have a compatible personality types, that we all see eye to eye on these like issues, and kind of a hostility towards sanctimonious, as you put it. Because I feel maybe it's different in the departments, in the academic departments you guys were in, but in my department, like with political theorists, I'm probably the only one who likes Zizek of anybody that I
Really?
come across. Probably. There might be like one person who likes him, but most of them might have like some affection, but kind of vague, and they don't really know. They don't really take him. They don't bother paying attention. They kind of listen to what their professors have said about not taking him seriously. I think I hate to say it, but I think Zizek is developing a reputation in certain departments to just be like one of those clownish academics you don't need to take seriously, which is a real shame and a real mistake. Of course, we all, I'm sure, would agree.
And what's funny is way before YouTube was a thing, like his book Sublime Objective Ideology was like praised, and everyone thought it was the new thing in psychoanalysis. If you buy anthologies from that time, Sublime Objective Ideology is always in it. I don't know if they still are, but like it's like his image overcame his academic reputation, when he definitely had in the 90s academic reputation before people saw, the baggy sweat stained shirts and that he touches his face a lot. But that is almost like a cruel irony that proves his point, is like they found out that this guy wasn't, a buttoned up suit, feather cap academic sitting in front of a bookshelf. He was like walking down the street double fisting hot dogs or whatever. So, he proves that, he kind of proves his own point by doing that. We're praising him only, of course, and he does reuse his own quotations all the time. He sucks at writing, like factually sucks. So it's not like everything's good, but I think we're kind of responding to the project as a whole as something favorably.
Very worthwhile. He has a great sense of humor about himself, though. Like, I actually met my wife when we were at a Zizek lecture. Right? It was a 3-day thing, and I was shocked because he gave 2 weeks. Sorry, he gave this little story where he was like, "This is the thing. Like, I was seriously thinking about killing myself," which was kind of shocking to hear him say that, right? Because like, as it would be with anybody, right? And he's like, I was thinking about killing myself, and I went to talk to like my psychoanalyst, and like I was like, I'm going to kill myself this week. And my psychoanalyst turned to me and was like, no, you can't do that. You've already paid for the next 2 sessions. And I paused, and I was like, well, she's right. I'm not going to let her like grift me out of this money. So I showed up for the next 2 sessions, and then at the end of like the first one, she was like, make sure you pay me more. So I did, and then I realized, like, well, no, I'm not going to let her grift me out of like a few more sessions. I'm going to stay alive just to show up for these things. And I was like, he's got a good sense of humor about himself, right? Like, that's kind of a very dark story about yourself. But he managed to make it very relatable.
He's
and funny.
Very transparent about how embarrassed he is at his own appearance, at his own, like, he talks about how those movies he was in, right? The Pervert's Guide to Cinema and The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. In an interview I saw, like, someone was like, oh, have you seen them? Like, what do you think? And he's like, it's impossible. He's like, I can't look at myself. He's like, the trauma is the horror and the trauma is too great to just look at myself. I can't stand it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice that he can combine that level of hilarity with saying fairly profound and cogent things.
And you know what? He's really nice. Like, he will.
Yeah, he's a nice guy.
I mean, I met him only once, but like, he's willing to just talk to anybody about what they want to talk to, even though he's trying to be ushered into a car because he's late to get to the airport. just like having chats with people. It's impossible to get a word in though. Like I don't think we could ever have him on here. He just talks endlessly.
Oh, but if you wanted to come, we should just have him come just to talk.
All right, I'll sit here silently.
We'll have like a skeleton crew, and we'll ask him some questions. Yeah, that would be pretty cool.
No, but I mean, like, it seems to me like we all really like the guy, and I think like Pills was kind of right. Maybe it's a generational thing because when I started reading theory, his books were very, very popular and only became more so over time. But I also do think it's kind of an attitudinal issue.
Maybe he's what we want a boomer to be.
Yeah, it really fits with our kind of independent media, get it out of the university, make stuff widely available for free kind of idea. Because most people know him from YouTube, not from his books.
I mean, one example that I saw people talking about was his debate with Jordan Peterson, just to bring Daddy back for 2 seconds, right? Because people expected that this was going to be like a heavyweight boxing match, right? Where you had like the lead philosopher on the political right, however you want to characterize, Peterson, versus like the lead philosopher on the political left. And the thing is, Peterson does speak as like an authority figure quite deliberately sometimes, right? Where, he has this authoritative, almost prophetic kind of rhetoric that surrounds him, or at least did prior to 2020, right? And when Zizek appeared and was kind of congenial, kind of funny, a bit laid back, wasn't taking it too seriously, people were initially disappointed. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that over time, more and more people seem to have conceded that he won that debate. And I think one of the reasons is because he refused to be an authority figure, right? He more or less pointed out the problems with Peterson as an authority figure and the kind of associated difficulties with that, and said, hey, listen, I'm just here for you to provoke you to be more critical and ask questions about things. And people were inspired by that and thought it was insightful, right? And a lot of them did. And that's one of the reasons that I think he's popular, right? He refuses the mantle that a lot of people have tried to shove onto him.
He's the YouTube philosopher. And I mean that in a positive sense, not a negative sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Shall we wrap it up there?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, it sounds good to me.
All right. I'll see you guys. I don't know when. I'll see you guys.
Well, hopefully there'll be that video. I'm looking forward to that new video, Pills.
Yeah, I gotta bust my ass to get it done. So that's what I'm gonna be doing for the next 5 days straight.
Should be spicy.
All right, thanks, guys. See you, Matt, Eric, Victor.
What if I see you first?